Hello everyone and welcome to the second Altmetric Book Club webinar. This session is all about marketing insights that Altmetric data and tools can provide to book publishers. So thank you so much for joining us. Just to introduce today's presenters, my name's Josh. I'm the marketing manager at Altmetric, and I'm just going to be going through some housekeeping today and introducing our speakers. I'm joined by Sarah Grimmer, who is the Director of Strategic Accounts at Digital Science. And our guest speaker today that we're really pleased that's joining us is David Giannetto, who's an author and the CEO of WorkWave. David is the author of 3 books. He's also a thought leader and former professor of organizational behavior in the world-ranked Rutgers program and the CEO of WorkWave. So just to go over what we're going to cover today, we've got a little housekeeping just to make sure everyone has the best webinar experience that they can. Then we'll move on to Sarah's presentation, just talking about data-driven marketing insights that Altmetric data and tools can provide. Then we're going to move on to David's session about how publishers can work with authors and help them to connect with media. So just a little housekeeping now. We are recording this session. All registrants will receive a link to the recording, and we will post it on our YouTube and Figshare channels, so you can go back and look at the recording later. All attendees are currently muted. If you have any technical issues, please send the host a private chat for assistance in the little chat box there, just in case you can't see us or see the slides or hear us, just pop us a little message in the chat box. If you have any questions, please do type them into the questions box as you think of them, and we'll get to those at the end. We'll have a Q&A session at the end that we'll go through and check if we have any questions and go through those then. So please do enter them as you think of them while the presenters are giving their sessions. So without further ado, I'll pass on to our first speaker, Sarah Grimmer. So I'll just there we go.
Thank you very much, Josh. Okay, thank you everyone for attending on a lovely Thursday morning or afternoon. I'm going to try not to speak for too long because I think that David's talk will be absolutely fantastic. And as he is an author himself, I want to make sure there's plenty of time for you all to listen to what his experience is with publishing. And having had a brief chat with him already, there's loads that he's going to share with this. But just quickly, before David starts, what I want to do is just for any of you on the phone who might not be familiar with what altmetrics are, I just want to do a bit of a recap on altmetrics in general and altmetric the product. So what are altmetrics? So primarily they're indicators of online engagement, and they complement traditional citation impact metrics. So you can think of them as being complementary to, but not in replacement of, things like impact factor, H-index, FCR and RCR, and they're really designed to be used in parallel to those other metrics rather than to replace them in any way. They tend to cover social things, policy, Wikipedia. The field of altmetrics can really be quite ginormous depending on what you're thinking about. They track all sorts of different things, discussions on peer reviews platforms, explanations or commentary on Wikipedia or on social media, coverage in news media or blogs, citations in non-journal sources. So policy documents, for example, is an absolutely fantastic non-journal source, or engagement on scholarly platforms, for example, F1000. And these all really are about tracking the attention around any kind of research output. So it could be an article, a data set, a trial, a book, of course, or a chapter. So really what they're about is providing conversation and context around any piece of research output. Altmetrics go really nicely hand in hand with traditional books data because they provide additional context to the performance of a book or a chapter. So we have all of these really well-established book metrics with there's website traffic, sales figures, downloads, citations. a lot of publishers even do their own searching on Twitter, or they follow their own press teams' efforts at press releases. But we think it's really healthy to use a variety of data when you're thinking about how to look at and respond to what's going on with your book collection. And what's great about Altmetrics is they really help you and your authors understand the bigger picture of book impact. So you can have web traffic. Web traffic is a wonderful thing, but what you might also have that you're not aware of, particularly with books, and we see this in books in a wonderful way that we don't always see with journal articles, is there can be policy documents written 10 to 15 years after the publication of a book that, okay, sure, that's not web traffic, but what that's showing is the longevity of a book and the importance of a book. And Altmetrics provides signals to the performance of books that really show the weight that books provide in societal discourse, I think. Very wordy way of putting it, but what I love about Altmetrics with books is they show so much more about what's really going on beyond just traffic or sales figures. Altmetric for books has been around for a long time. Many of you will be, of course, familiar with Altmetric as a product. We started tracking attention in 2012. We started curating sources and tracking outputs in 2013. We launched a product called Bookmetrics for Springer Nature in 2015. And in 2016, we actually started launching badges for books. And what we're now doing is expanding badges, and we've built another product called the Altmetric Book Index, which is all about tracking a number of those different outputs in a way that means that publishers can actually start to manipulate and understand the data behind book performance. So we track a number of different sources of attention. We've got news outlets, of course, policy sources, social media, blogs, Wikipedia, YouTube, the Open Syllabus project for any of you working on textbooks, post-publication peer review, Mendeley, and citations. And each of these provides something very different. So Mendeley, for example, gives a really good understanding of what the scholarly community is actually doing with book output, because of course the scholarly community is saving a lot of the books or journal articles or whatever in their Mendeley libraries. The Open Syllabus project is an excellent way of looking at textbook attention, and it's one of the few ways of actually tracking and looking at how syllabus, how teaching is actually relating to what's being published. So each of these sources offers something very different. Policy sources offer a very societal impact perspective. News tells us what's going on in the world. So right now, if you were looking at the Altmetric Explorer, you'd see a tremendous bug around coronavirus. And social media gives a sense of buzz for right now. And if you look at a book over time, what you'll see is a lot of attention in the early days on social media, but the longevity tends to be towards policy sources, Wikipedia, or Mendeley, because there's a richness to that data that collects over time. There's a lot of challenges for authors, of course, and some of the key ways where Altmetric data can help is helping authors understand what influence their book has had. And that's where I think publishers have huge potential to use Altmetric data, because you're talking to authors constantly and can feed that information back. Seeing the return on the time that goes into publishing. And this one, for me, is really key. When we approach an author and we say, we want you to publish for us, for the author, it's really important to understand what they're going to get out of it, given the time. And yes, they often get royalties, but it can also be equally important to say to them, your book has actually been cited in 10 different policy documents related to clean water or sustainable energy or whatever the case may be. And it's actually showing to them the societal impact that their book is having. And of course, another thing is finding readers. And one of the beauties of Altmetric is it can actually give information back or give signals back to show how, for example, Twitter as a source can actually drive tremendous amount of traffic to a book. And of course, publishers also have a lot of challenges. We know that. I was a publisher for a very long time, and I'm well acquainted with a lot of the challenges. And the key ones that I see is that what we can really do with Altmetrics is we can get and help authors get attention to their books, and we can really help authors in the promotion of their books and track the return on investment of those efforts. So if you're spending a tremendous amount of money, for example, on Twitter, but you're seeing absolutely no pickup via Altmetric, what you can see is, okay, perhaps that was not the right way to promote this book. Your press office might be putting hours of time into sending out press releases, and yet you're getting very little press pickup, whereas your competitors are. They're the kinds of things that you can start to look at. And really, if we drill down to how can Altmetrics help, this is a very short list, but really it's about understanding where and how books and chapters are being discussed online, reporting back to authors and editors on the success of promotional activities and of their work, measuring the success of marketing and press activity, tracking competitor titles. There's a huge amount of information you can do with competitor titles, and really showcasing the reach of your community to potential authors. I think many of you will not be surprised if I say many publishers say that it's getting harder and harder to attract potential authors. There's a wealth of information via Altmetrics that really show how important books are to the scholarly ecosystem. And so much of that data can actually be used to create a really compelling case to convince researchers that it's worth their time to publish books. So that last one in particular, I think, is very near and dear to my heart personally. So just a couple of different use cases that you may like to think about. The first one is really, why should you publish with us? So I'm a publisher, and what I'm looking for here is specific data points. This statement may be controversial, but not all publishers are equal, and I mean that in the best possible way. So some publishers have fantastic press departments. Some publishers, particularly society publishers, tend to focus on one particular area of research, and it's really important to know your strengths. So if we think, for example, about engineering, patents are hugely important for the field of engineering and for authors of engineering books, journals, and any other content type. What might be really nice for you to do as a publisher of an engineering list is actually compare your backlist of books, monographs, with your competitors. It's very easy to do that. We have patents as a source type. And you can literally just download the data and actually look at how your books, compared to your competitors, actually show up in patents as patent citations historically. And what you can actually do is showcase that information to potential authors. So imagine if you were desperately trying to convince someone to publish with you. They were very keen not to do so, and then all of a sudden you were able to say to them, we consistently have higher patent mentions than any of our other publishers, any of the other publishers in this field. And what that's doing is giving you evidence to get that author to publish with you. In a similar vein, I think a really important thing is what I like to call visibility in a crowded space. There are many, many publishers out there. Every author has a lot of choice in who they choose to publish with. And what they want to know is that the publisher that they've chosen or that has approached them has the right market to showcase their work to the widest possible community. They're really busy. They're getting asked to peer review. They're writing papers. We all know what the 50 things they're doing. And it's really important as publishers that we can showcase the strength of what we do by showing the reach that titles have. Now, I very, very quickly ran a search, literally in about 2 minutes, to show this book here, Women versus Feminism, and to show the huge amount of reach that this paper actually has, this book actually has geographically. This book is quite new. I wanted to choose something recent so that you could see how attention comes to a book so quickly. But then what I can also do is actually run a list, and this list is based on books on feminism in the last 2 years. And what I want to do here is, this is specific to one publisher. What this publisher could do is actually take this list with this badge information here and send this out as an email campaign, for example, to say to potential authors, our books get a lot of attention, you should think about publishing with us. The next thing is that you can build a social network very easily for marketing books. All you really need to do here is actually look at the top 5 Twitter accounts in a certain area. In this case, what we've done is we've built a search around town planning and building. And what we can actually do here is find the people who are blogging or tweeting most about this subject area, and very, very simply build a network around this. So we could contact these people. We could ask them if they wanted to be involved in any of the work we did. Some of these individuals may actually be researchers. There's a number of different things that we can do with this list. And then the last thing I've got here is, the second last thing is we can also look for a book reviewer. Book reviews in journals are tremendously important. If you ask researchers, they absolutely love them. And if you ask publishers, publishers always also say how important they are. But what we're seeing is that they have decreased over the last decade. So what we need to do is really identify the best bloggers or the best journalists that might actually be able to work with us to write those fantastic reviews. So what we can actually do is if we play around with the Altmetric Explorer, we can actually do a search that helps us look for newspapers or blogs that are publishing a lot in the space that we're looking at. So for example, if we are in the social sciences, doesn't matter what our search is, what we can actually do is curate a very careful search that will help us to identify who the main sources are that are blogging or are writing, and then we can contact those individuals to ask them if they will write us a book review. And then the last example I have is birthday reviews. I like this one, celebrating success. What you will find with Altmetrics for books is that they occur at a very different rate from journal articles. So what you see with journal articles is a lot of activity happens over the first year or two, particularly on social media. With books, they actually mature at a different rate. And interestingly, if you looked at a 10-year period, you would see about the same number of or level of attention for a book as for a journal, but it happens at a very, very different rate. So for the first anniversary, you might like to send an alert out to your community saying, look at all these books and look at how well cited they were by typical citation data or by Mendeley. But then 5 years later, you might have very different information, and 10 years later, you're going to have even more detailed information around citations on patents or policy documents or other really rich sources of information. Imagine being an author and actually getting an email saying, well done, congratulations, 5 years in, you've got these fantastic citations on policy documents. And it's really valuable to share these with your authoring community and to show that there is both ongoing support for that book, but ongoing support in showing awareness for what that book has achieved. So they're just a few short things from me. I apologize if I've rattled that off a little bit fast, but hopefully now we'll have time for David. Now, Josh, I think I've just stopped sharing and you should now have access.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'll just make David the presenter.
Hey there, everyone. My name's Dave Giannetto. Just give me a second while I make sure that we're showing the right screen.
Looks good.
All right, great. Like I said, my name's Dave Giannetto. I'll give you a little bit of insight into my background, just so you know what my perspective is. So I'm the author of 3 books. The first was The Performance Power Grid, that was published by Wiley. The second was actually The Decoy Artist. So the Power Grid is a business theory book, and then the Decoy Artist is narrative nonfiction. So that is a true story written like a novel. It's a more popular genre today. If you're not familiar with it, it's a way to tell, to write about history, but in a way that the reader finds it more entertaining. So certainly a departure from business theory, and that's with Pelican. And then my third book, Big Social Mobile, was with Palgrave Macmillan and a great team there. That was a business theory book. So the thing that's also important to note about myself as an author is that I was an executive in the technology space working with a bunch of clients as a consultant would, let's say. So we had a firm and a bunch of clients, and they would deploy technology. And the Performance Power Grid was the methodology that we were using with these clients. So we productized that into a book and went with Wiley. Now, a lot of times with folks like myself, Wiley is entering what we might think of as pay-to-play type of contracts. Really, the author is paying them in order to use Wiley because it's a great brand on the book. And that's the way those type of consultants use Wiley to build their own personal brand. I was able to work with Wiley in a more traditional sense as an author, and it was a good relationship. So that's my background, and it does color my views and things. I had a long learning curve over the course of these books. It probably spanned 6, 7, 8 years. I forget how many years. Well, 10 years exactly there. So keep that in mind as I'm going through this and giving my perspective. The one thing I will note is that it doesn't look like the screen is updating. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so you'll see the 3 books there. And then the one thing I will note is that when you have 3 book deals with good publishers, you get a lot of other authors talking to you, and you go to events with authors. So I do have my perspective, but I think my perspective is also kind of influenced by what I've seen amongst authors across the board with a lot of different publishers. I can tell you first off, for myself, I was not a top tier author. So I didn't have publishers rushing to me. We did get a number of offers for the first book and the third book, the business theory books, because I had a pretty decent platform. I had great customers. I had a decent name. I was speaking already at conferences. I was a columnist for folks like the US Business Review. So I had a bit of a platform. And in 2006, to have that kind of a platform was certainly attractive. It's different than, a little bit different than what you'd have today. So I didn't have publishers rushing to me. It was more about my agent going out and trying to find the right publisher. And in truth, that was largely based on the relationships that he had. And then we got a couple offers, and we did look at it through the lens of who could help us more, but not anything like the altmetrics that you saw today. Nobody was pitching us in that perspective. So we were looking more at what they were offering, the timeline, how much support did we think we would get from them when it came to the marking period of time. And I think that's what how the average author looks at it. Most of them, if you have a big platform, then it gets very competitive. But for the average author that is just building their platform, they're asking for a lot of help from the publisher. It's amazing the amount of authors that think that having a successful book is actually about writing a great book. And I think what I learned over the course of 10 years was that unfortunately those two things don't have huge correlation in the commercial market. I think when you go into academics and all those things, it radically changes and you get a lot more vetting. But for a commercial author like myself, it's much more of an equation of that publisher looking at you and asking how you can drive sales. I will note that with Pelican, because it was narrative nonfiction, it was a different relationship. I would say I did feel like they were happy to have me. They looked at me as somebody that had written for Wiley. I could certainly write. I had an agent. I had things that they sometimes didn't get with authors. So there was quite a bit of a different feel with Pelican and their approach to things. But that was a lot more niche-y than big commercial books like Business Theory. So that's my perspective on how the average author looks at publishing. They're just happy to get the deal, and then they want to write a great book, and they're not really focused on what comes after that. Whereas my advice to them is to tell them they need to start thinking now about what comes after that, because they are thinking about a great book first. Tied to that is a great title, and they're not thinking like a great marketer. And in truth, many of the folks that write books are not great marketers. That's not their background. So if you look at Big Social Mobile, the last book, it was a great title. It grabbed them right away. It made it very easy for my publisher or my agent to sell that book to a good publisher like Palgrave Macmillan, which I was super thrilled to work with. I had a lot of respect for them. And we were kind of off to the races. They felt like I could write a good book. That wasn't their concern. What they were really looking at was my platform. And because this was my third book, has this guy learned how to sell books yet? And I think we were able to convince them that, hey, I understood that this is about selling books, not about writing a great book. That is somewhat secondary. So it's challenging to get authors to think that way. And when I reflect back on the publishers, they didn't bring that message forward to me, even in a more direct way or a more gentle way. I didn't look at them as partners to focus on selling books during the writing phase of the book. And I think a lot of how you write a book makes it inherently more marketable. You have to be thinking of how we'll market this book, after the fact. But the publishers maybe at the time weren't really helping me think that way or create content that was going to be easily marketable. So I would have loved it if they had talked that through with me, talked about the type of things we were going to be doing after the fact. And instead, that was mostly left up to me. And there was a pretty steep learning curve there, even for myself, who was a consultant at the time and writing for good magazines and speaking quite a bit. So much earlier, I would get the author on board about thinking about marketing and what that's going to look like down the road. If you take, for example, Big Social Mobile, which is tied to 3 very important themes: big data, social media, mobile technology. That's why the publisher loved it, because those were super topical. And then if you look at the subtitle there, it doesn't call those out. So I would have loved for the publisher to come back to me and understand that driving results in like Google and Amazon, for example, is really about understanding the way those search engines work, the way people find things, and the difference between title, subtitle, and narrative content in how search terms and how search engines look at those. The publishers I was dealing with didn't really think in those terms. They were more living in a world where books are physical things. Yes, you were trying to build your Twitter following, your YouTube following, all these things around an author, but they weren't looking at it from a perspective that what's going to drive the ability to sell this book is really people thinking, you know, my job has to do with big data. I love big data. It's interesting. Let me go look for a book on big data. So maybe with Big Social Mobile, I would have made sure that big data was in the subtitle. Now that I have at my company here at WorkWave, we have a full New York City agency, for example, that supports our customers. These are service customers. It has nothing to do with the publishing industry. I've learned some of the way search engines think, and if I released a book now, very easily with just a few hours of their time, they would create a pretty great bed for that book to be effective online. So I wasn't getting that type of advice, and what happened was we missed the opportunity. We didn't realize it until after the fact that, wow, we really should have thought about just how important the subtitle could be in having people find the book because they're interested in the topic of the book, right? That doesn't work with the decoy artist, because the number of people looking for books on decoys is very slim. It's not drowned out by the number of business theory books there are. But if you want a book on big data, you know, there's going to be 5 standout books. Big Social Mobile might be one of them, but a book with big data in the title is going to jump up so much far ahead of a book like mine. And I would have loved to leverage the power of search engines and the power of that title that was inherently there, but I didn't know enough at the time. So I would really suggest to publishers that they think about the digital space and how authors are going to stand out in the digital space. Because it's one thing if you have a very linear relationship. I go on a show, or I sit down with somebody that's talking technology, and there's an audience for that show, that podcast, that television show, and the viewers are interested in that. So there's a correlation there. They're booking me because they feel I'm going to be appealing to their audience. So there's a tie-in there. But think of all the people that don't know or don't watch or don't listen to that show. How do they find that content? If they're doing some research on big data or social media, you know, the topics of this book, they have to search it. So access to audience or potential buyers is huge through search engines if your book is tied to topics. And that to me was one of the biggest things I learned, was that you've got to think much more topical in the content of the book. And if I was writing now, my agent's going out to talk to publishers again right now, I would be thinking in a much more chunky way than I might have thought, even with Big Social Mobile. And by the time my 3rd book came out, I really understood how I had to think. But I would really double down on that if I was doing it now, because you're taking chunks, whether it's a chapter or a section or just a concept, and you need to tie that out to something that gives you an extended reach. So you could be thinking about what are the type of podcasts that I need to get on for if the top 10 podcasts for business theory books, business books, or business leadership books, like where my last one is spun towards, and how do I understand those outlets and therefore make sure that I have something in the content that directly appeals to that outlet. I think that you can be flexible enough in how you approach subjects of a book that you can write for specific outlets, but also not lose what was important to you as an author about that topic and still see it through your own eyes. You don't have to appeal to the hosts, for example, or the outlets directly, but you need to make sure that you're writing in a way that's very friendly for them. You're tying it to something topical that they're going to be interested in. So, for example, I attended a conference in New York City, and it was all to teach authors about how to connect to media. And I was a guest speaker there, and I got to mix in with a lot of first-time authors, and they put them through the paces of actually pitching to media, because it's the author for most publishers that's responsible for media outreach. And in my experience, I was given a list of contacts, that the publishers had worked for before. And Wiley and Palgrave were big publishers, so you would have thought they'd have a huge one, but they really didn't. They weren't handing me a long list of potential places that I could pitch this book to. So I had to figure out how to get them, and that's what this conference was trying to teach to these authors. How do you go get? How do you figure out what media might be interested? And then when you do, how do you pitch them? And I think the light bulb moment when authors start to realize how to do it effectively is the author has to set aside what's important to them, and they have to look at through the eyes of that outlet and say, okay, how do I pitch this book to this outlet? And it's got to be connected through something that's very, very topical. So let me give you an example. Here I am, Big Social Mobile, 2 business theory books. People think of me as the guy who takes very complex topics and methodologies and breaks them down into a very pragmatic approach that companies can adopt to see an ROI from that complex theory. Right? That's my niche if I'm speaking or writing. How does that guy end up on the Jenny McCarthy show? It's because I learned that if I listen to Jenny, and I don't really know Jenny, I only sat down with her for a couple hours there with the book. She's really interested in things like the dark web. She's just interested in that type of stuff. So I listened to her, she talked about that. I spun my understanding of how companies use social media and data and mobile technology to target and identify and manipulate consumers. And I spun that into how companies are doing that and how that plays out across the World Wide Web and the dark web. And because I could put that in terms that were of interest to her, her booking agent, the person who handles that showrunner, latched onto it because she knew that the host would be interested in it. So then you have somebody like me, a business theory guy, sitting down on the Jenny McCarthy show. Did that yield a lot of books? I don't know, but it yielded a lot of attention. And that's what I wanted, because it really made me stand out amongst my peer group, because I was able to cross that line into more mainstream and get out of technology or business theory. And it's a good example because an author who gets good at understanding how you have to take your content and tie it to something topical will be able to break out of the C-level media into like the B-level media. It might not put you on CNN, right? For CNN, you need to have that and you need to have a good platform. But you can certainly get into much more impactful B-level media if you can spin it into something very topical. So for me, an example of an effective use would be when everything started to fall apart and it became very obvious that Facebook had a tremendous amount of information, data on people, and was using it for their purposes, whether you think it's helpful or nefarious. In my book, in Big Social Mobile, I actually laid out every field that Facebook was collecting. And I had that model right in the book. I understood it. I was ahead of the curve with the book and talking about this well before things blew up, but I wasn't getting the media attention because nobody cared about you know, this small author raising their hand and going, do you understand what they're collecting about you? But once it blew up, I was well positioned to say, hey, look, this is what they've been collecting on you for a long time. Look, let me show you, let me lay it out. But at the same time, for me personally, I got promoted to a C-level position in my career, right? Because I was using books to drive a career. I was not selling tremendous volume of books through outlets like Amazon. I was selling bulk. I was able to pick up 1,000 books and sell them at an event, or go into one of my clients and sell 2,000 or 3,000 books to one of these global clients of mine. They would buy it, they would adopt it, and they would use their methodologies in the book. That's why I was appealing to publishers, because I could sell books in big chunks, even though I wasn't effective. Let's say through Amazon, if you looked it up, you're not going to be super impressed. That's because when that crisis hit with Facebook, I was promoted in my career. So I set aside the book and all of the time consuming, all the time consumption that goes along with trying to find a media outlet, spin your message to it, do the legwork, get on the show, and then you have your 15 minutes or 1 hour of fame. And within that process, I think there's an opportunity for publishers to help authors, because when I listen to Sarah talk about altmetrics and stuff, I have a tendency to think in terms of myself as an author, but I think the real win there is for publishers to use that over the course of time, because generally speaking, publishers operate within certain niches. Even if it's a huge one like business theory, within that there are sub niches like mine, applied theory, technology, emerging technology. You, over the course of time, can build up the outlets which will be happy to have authors. So like C-level media, they need people to come on and talk. And if you're a publisher, you're automatically getting a more reputable group of people. So if you're pitching out, giving this list out to your authors, you can really cut all that searching time down for the author. And maybe publishers can't pitch to specific media, right? Maybe the author has to do that, especially with something very expert oriented like the stuff that I write. But you can cut down that process by saying to them, hey, look, we've worked with 50 authors over the last two years. These are the outlets where they've been able to get themselves booked, and these are the ones we're seeing an ROI on. And these other ones over here, there's no real ROI, but you know what that does? It builds your platform if you want to pursue that. You can really give the author an understanding of the landscape they have to operate within. And if you work with an author that understands the way you chunk up material and pitch it in alignment with current things, then you could draw on this database that you have. And when the author hands you content and says, look, right now Facebook is in the news and they're getting in a lot of trouble because of all this data. Well, that's in the book. Let me give you a paragraph pitch that you can then blow out to all the outlets you've built relationships with over the time, because you've had all these authors coming through your publishing house on working in the same niche. That database of contacts is tremendously valuable to an author, because they just don't have a very easy ability to consolidate all those names into one database. If the author chunks it up for you, then you can pitch it on their behalf. But the publisher would have had to tell me that that's what you need to do. Whereas I figured it out on my own across the course of 3 books and working with my agent and some other folks. And maybe that's my failure, I don't know. But I think that a lot of the first time authors that I'm talking to, they don't understand that, and nobody's telling them. And because it's a process that you have to go through to get attention. If you learn the process, you can be effective, I don't know, 2/3 of the time, I would bet you, or more. I bet you I could get on almost any C-level media outlet I wanted, not because I'm so great, but because I understand the process of gaining their attention and convincing them that I'm a decent guest. So that is the journey I went through, and some of the takeaways, just to reflect back on it, things I wish I had if I was talking to myself now. I know from the folks that I work with here in my own agency, in my company, that if I had spent a few hours with them prior to the release of any of the book, it has to be in the writing phase early on, that they would have made my head spin, but the result would have been that I would have been able to produce a book that automatically ranked better in important categories and could be found and there could be bought more easily. If I had been taught how to access media, if that process had been explained to me up front, I know that I could have done a lot better, of course, across the course of the 3 books. A very tangible thing that I think media publishers can do is give you a list of media that they've been effective with in the past with other authors. That's kind of the luxury a publisher has over an author. An author sits in Starbucks with his laptop or her laptop writing, and they just are overwhelmed usually across the course of 9 months of writing this book, that they don't have time to really start thinking about marketing until it's too late. You have to get to them early, and you have to talk through how they're going to market very early so that they can structure writing around that. And you really can do it. I mean, I went out and built relationships with technology companies in the 3rd book, right? I didn't do it in the first one, but by the 3rd one, I learned, go out, build relationships now in key categories like big data. Who are the top players in big data technology? Go talk to them, get quotes from those people in the book, mention their technology. And you know what? When the book comes out, they'll buy a whole bulk of the book and they'll give it out to all their employees and their key customer contacts. That's the way we sold copies of Big Social Mobile. But if I hadn't known that, I wouldn't have written the book that way. I would have just written it like like my first book. So there's things that you can have the authors do. I would have been much more aware of what's going on in the news and what did I predict to be going on in the news in the year or maybe 18 months, let's say, after the book came out. I would have really tried to think more predictively about, okay, well, this is going to happen. For example, I would have been able to sit there. I knew the space well enough to say, Facebook's going to blow up. Eventually, people are going to realize all the data they have and how they're using it. And it's going to blow up and it's going to be in the news. What's going to change as a result of it? Absolutely nothing is going to change because nothing really has changed. But there is going to be that window that you can get in there. And I would have taken the same content I wrote, spun it through that, been much more attention grabbing, and then I could have just used that to get hooks into media much more easily at that time. I was very bulk sales oriented because it helped my career. It's what publishers saw as opportunity with me. I mean, you would say like my next book, I have to move much more in the digital leadership direction, right? It's got to cross into mainstream for me to continue going as a writer with big publishers. They're going to want to see that type of ROI, or I have to stay very nichey. But there's a choice you're making, bulk sales oriented or not. And if you choose that, you can intentionally create content that helps you sell in bulk, if that's your platform. And yeah, somebody should have just said to me, hey, this is not about writing books. This is about selling books. Let's talk about how we're going to do that right now. And you know, the author is like any other creative person. They want to be recognized for their work. They want to be patted on the back. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be on the radio, on television, in print. So it doesn't have to have a negative connotation. Maybe I'm phrasing it like it has a negative connotation. It doesn't. They want you to help them sell. That's really why they're writing this book, so that people read it. Selling is the vehicle to do that. So they'll be really receptive to it if it's approached the right way. So there you go. That's my view. Maybe we'll open it up and see if you have any questions, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, David. That was a really great session. I think, yeah, some really helpful insights there. I will just take back the presenter mode and then we'll go on to the Q&A. Okay. Like I say, if you do have any questions for David or indeed for Sarah, please do put them into the questions box. Just looking now, we have received a question from Phaedra Kress, who's also an Altmetric ambassador. She asks, how would you describe, David, the evolution of needing to be a great marketer 10 years ago to now? What advice would you give to aspiring new authors? So a couple of questions there.
Well, okay, so Phaedra happens to be a thought leader, what we would call an influencer. So she's a good example. Now, you know, it was interesting when Sarah was talking before, you know, she was talking about how do you reach the market and the changes in that. And the thing that really you have to focus a lot more on today is what is the landscape of people who are influential on your target audience. In the old days, that used to be just raw media outlets, magazines. I mean, that's why I was a columnist, right? Because I could drive attention through that, or getting on the radio, or even television if you can do it. Most of those things, I think, don't drive buyer behavior the way they used to. Right now, I think you're going to get a lot more traction if you are tightly tied to influencers. And there's going to be a set of influencers in every space that publishers publish books for. Every single one is going to have them, right? If you follow Marvel movies, there's a set of influencers that people who like Marvel movies watch. Comic book, every single category, there are influencers. Publishers should be understanding the reach and influence of these influencers and building relationships with them. And yes, your authors better write good books because the influencers make their money off being honest. So they will crush bad writers and bad books and bad ideas. But if your writers are good, your authors are good, to me, that's probably the most influential way to do it. So I would look to that as maybe the biggest change in the landscape that I've seen. That's social media. A lot of the content of Big Social Mobile is written around that very point. And I think that speaks right to what would the advice to new authors be. It would be understand a few things, I think, is what I always tell them. Writing is not about writing. Writing is about editing. And it's about editing because if you think what you write on Sunday morning is good enough for a real publisher to put in a book, then you're kidding yourself. This is not about being inspired and writing 500 words. This is about 9 months of effort to write 60,000 words that you probably cut down from 100,000 words. It is a game for the long haul. And all that suddenly becomes unimportant on the day the book is released because it's all in the past and it's only about selling it. And the more you can reinforce these points to authors, then the better chance you have of getting a result that's sellable. And I was only in the game of selling books. They weren't just to make me feel better. So that's what I was focused on. Maybe some of the smaller publishers can afford very niche books that don't have sales, but that's what I was going for.
Thanks so much. Just waiting to see if any more questions come in. Do let us know in the questions box if you do have anything you'd like to ask David or Sarah. Just a question from me actually. If a publisher was to create a guide for authors for promoting their books, what would you like to be in it? What would you recommend be in it?
If a publisher had handed me a guide, I think maybe I'm a very process-oriented person, but to me, the biggest light bulb moment was when I understood it, that getting to media in any form is a process. There's a process to categorize them, to figure out what they're interested in, what their spin is on within their outlet towards a topic or a set of topics, how you reach out to them, how you pitch to them, how you get booked. That is a formulaic process that if you run it, you can be successful, 2/3 of the time. With C media, I think you can be successful 90% of the time. But even if you want to be on A-list media, then you still have to follow this process as well. To me, that guide would be there, and they would say, this is what you're going to have to do at the end of it, and then you can back it into the actual content of the book. And you could probably ask me 100 different questions all around that, and I would probably keep coming back to that, because it is the vehicle that gets you into any outlet. If you're connecting with an influencer, well, they're either writing on a blog or on LinkedIn or something, or they're publishing videos on YouTube, or it's a podcast, or they have, or maybe radio shows these days a little bit. You have to hook them too, and the way you're hooking them is through whatever their spin is to their audience on topics that are important to them. If it's a magazine, it's the same thing. They're not just going to publish a chapter because it's in your book. It has to be somewhat related to that media outlet, and this is stuff that publishers know inherently, but the author doesn't know that up front. So you have to educate them on how you market things versus the topic that they're an expert in, that they're writing a book about, that they will then have to go out and figure out how to sell.
Fantastic advice there. Just got another question. As a publisher, what should we be doing different? And that comes from Orion Mendes.
I don't want to sound like a broken record. And I worked with great publishers. I mean, Pelican was a family-owned publisher, and they really were great people. I was super impressed with the team at Palgrave. But I think most of the conversations revolved around layout, content, how were you on time or not. My agent was the guy reading the book and saying whether or not it was garbage and I needed to redo something or not. They didn't understand the topic well enough to really give that kind of advice. So the interactions with them were mostly around the mechanics of writing a book and making sure that I met deadlines and gave things to them in a format that they needed and all that kind of stuff. I didn't feel like I had strong partners that were there in the bigger sense. Now my agent, had those relationships, but that was more of a business transaction between the agent and the publisher. So there wasn't anybody in the mix talking about the bigger picture of how this is going to go and what it's going to be like. I mean, I had figured it out after the first book because I was operating in a big market with a business theory book. But even by the time the third book came around, with a company, with a group that was as great as Palgrave Macmillan, you would have thought there would be a custodian of me that was talking about the bigger picture of the book and making sure I was on track to write something that was sellable. Now, it's great for me because I had a group of buyers with bulk, but I wouldn't say that book came anywhere near what its potential was through, what do we call them, commercial outlets. And I don't think I was thinking that way. I was applying the same formula I knew over and over and over. And then by the time the book came out, I knew how to get press attention, but I'm not sure, I certainly didn't do everything with the book as a vehicle that I could have. Somebody should have been the custodian of me, even by the time I was doing my third book, to help me understand that and be thinking broader about things. And I've not seen a publisher do that. I'm sure there's good ones out there that I just haven't had the luxury of working with yet in that capacity.
That sort of brings us on to Orion's next question, which you've sort of touched on a little bit. What sort of partnership is ideal between a publisher and author, do you think?
Well, I don't know how many books, there's different types of publishers. Some don't publish that many books per year, and then there's some that just pump out books, but the staff should be somewhat proportional to the amount of authors you're working with. I really believe that the closer you are with the author, the more you make that author feel like you're on their side, the better off you are. I think it's a mix of custodian and taskmaster and person who can give some tough feedback if the content just isn't shaping up and the agent's not filling that role for them, because the publisher's probably the editor, responsible editor at the end of this. But I think there's also this piece of it, which is the psychologist and the business planner of where this book is going to go. Even if you're just sitting down and talking about with that author about, okay, what do you envision happening after the book comes out? You know, and talking through the target audience very clearly. I was a business writer, so I understood target audience, you know, inherently because you sell software to targeted groups. But if you take somebody like Pelican, for example, you know, they had folks writing on folk art. I mean, my book was folk art, decoys, American decoys, quilting, you know, cooking. These are folks that are passionate about quilts, let's say. If you sit down and have a conversation and just ask them, okay, how do you think you'll be able to reach people who are interested in quilts and get them interested in the book? How do you think that will play out? And just have that conversation to drive it forward and get them to quantify what that plan is. I think it will be helpful. And there's publishers at either end of the spectrum. You know, when I write a book proposal for my agent, the most important section is how will this book be promoted and sold now. Other than that, it's just whether or not it's a good hook. To be honest, that's what I think. That's how I think publishers are looking at it. So hopefully gives a feel from my perspective on it, at least.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think we've got time for one last question, which I think just to wrap things up, what would you say were your top 5 takeaways that you would like the book publisher audience that we have here to kind of go away and think of at the moment from your presentation?
Well, it's interesting to see Altmetric and the stuff Sarah showed and talked about, because I had not worked with publishers who were really quantifying things like that. I was really only working through, of her categories, news, social, blogs, YouTube, you know, those kind of venues, and then the more traditional like radio and stuff. So I hadn't seen anyone that had quantified really any aspect of how this would work after the book came out. So if you can talk about yourself as a publisher in those terms and make a strong pitch back to the author that this is how we can help you, then I think that you can get the authors you want to get, because I don't think the average publisher is talking to the authors that way. So there's an author you really want to pursue. I think being able to show them in concrete terms how you can help them because you've helped other authors, how you're giving them a leg up on sales, I think it's going to be super enticing. I would have taken less money in order to get that kind of help, because reach was more important to me than the actual money that comes from the book. So that to me is a huge one. And we talked quite a bit about how you can get them thinking about what happens after the book comes out very early on. We talked about what that process of reaching out to media and how you need to be able to tie it to something very, very topical. The more topical, the better you can be. You know, there's a bunch of authors on television right now because of the health crisis. They would never have gotten there if they couldn't figure out how to tie whatever made them an expert, and it's often a book, to the virus, right? If they can do that and they have a decent platform, they can get, you know, media right now that they could never get. But there's a whole bunch of experts and people who wrote books about pandemics that are sitting at home who didn't think of how to tie their content out to this crisis in the media, because it's 24/7 news cycle, right? They need experts. They need to fill this time across all these outlets. You just have to be effective at pitching yourself as relevant. So I hope those are tangible enough as takeaways.
That's really great. Yeah, thanks so much for those, David. I think that's pretty much all the time we have left. Thank you so much to everyone that joined us for this Q&A and the presentation. Just to go through, just if you would like to find out more about Altmetrics and Altmetric data and tools, we do have a YouTube channel where you can find webinar recordings. You can find the recording of the last book club webinar that we did at the end of last year on the YouTube channel and on Figshare. You can also follow us on social media at Altmetric on Twitter and LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. If you'd like to email us with any questions about what we do or for a demonstration of Altmetric tools, please email info@altmetric.com. And we also have a podcast which has been going for about a year now. We have a regular episode that comes out every month, and then we have special episodes throughout the year. Our podcast can be found on SoundCloud and iTunes by searching Altmetric Podcast. And in that podcast, we explore the attention for a piece of research in the previous month, and we also have special episodes around specific topics that come out throughout the year. So thank you so much again for joining us. We will certainly be running another session soon in the next couple of months, hopefully. And like I say, the recording of this will be made available in the next couple of days and will be on the YouTube and Figshare channel. Thanks very much again. We hope to see you soon.